So it was the end of a homebrew AD&D campaign run by one of the most talented and long-suffering dungeon masters I know. Long-suffering because we were not the best group for him to DM for. This man, well, he liked mega dungeons. He and mega dungeons got on like Zero Punctuation and Silent Hill 2, like Jake Peralta and Die Hard, like semi-obscure references and this story. Mega dungeons were his bread and butter, and he wallpapered his bedroom with them. Like seriously, his wall was covered with maps of dungeons he had run for his players in the past. It may sound like he was a one-hit wonder DM, like that woman who wrote the first Hunger Games book and systematically dedicated the rest of her career to knuckling down and ruining it. But his non-mega dungeon parts were fantastic and great fun. We had adventures on pirate ships, on floating churches, in forts manned by hobgoblins, and even in a Benny Hill style chase following a pair of giant crystal frogs. In fact, they were so fun that for one reason or another, we barely ended up doing the mega dungeons. I feel bad for him, since he clearly enjoyed making and running them so much. We just weren't that kind of group, and this was one of the worst times. What started as our first mega dungeon campaign soon spiraled way out of control, like a happy little anti-aircraft missile bringing down a passenger plane, as we became embroiled in an all-out war as the humans in the south desperately tried to stop an advancing army of bloodthirsty elves in the north, who were moving southwards, burning cities as they go. My character, the de facto leader of the group by pure virtue of being the only melee fighter in a team of squishy magic types, was a paladin who came up with a plan to stop the elves, using this brilliant little strategy called extortion. We built a massive fortress on the north-south border, gathering a huge army of conscripts and mercenaries, and planned to stop the elves in their tracks. We called it the Black Bastion, which meant two things. It was a bastion of hope against the coming darkness, and our naming committee was either recently or shortly would be undergoing a bit of downsizing. Things started well, got better, and by afternoon tea and crumpets, they were an unmitigated triumph, either by virtue of being the only ones who thought to show up with our own dragons, or due to the fact that roughly a dozen storm giants were kicking around in our walls. Before we move forward, here's something you need to know about my paladin. He came from a village that was slaughtered by elves, and he was well aware of the tens of millions of innocent humans that had abruptly been taught some of the more advanced yoga positions by our genocidal friends. He was also a paladin of Tyr, a very no-nonsense justice god. And when I say justice, I mean that very particular brand of justice that was basically an eye for an eye. Not a very enlightened way of thinking, but pretty historically accurate. Adding the two things together, the elves should have been very lucky that we didn't follow them back to their home continent and show them how it feels. Now here's something you need to know about today's backstabber. You might remember him from the story where he had a mimic as a pet, and he was a gnome with a warforged mech suit complete with 2 character sheets. But all you need to know for this story was that he was a half-elf, specifically the leader of a revolutionary cell of elves called the Free Elves, see note on the naming committee above, who claimed, and I say claimed for reasons that will become very obvious, to be opposed to the Imperial Elves who were smashing everyone's stuff up. So he was an elf who had a much smaller than mine army of elves in a place where basically everyone hated elves. He also had a giant space gun, because in our world, the Gith were basically Star Wars aliens, and we had smashed a whole bunch of their stuff up before, to the point where we now had a massive artillery cannon that belonged to them. To say he was throwing up red flags would be the understatement of the century. From mid-game onwards, he was talking a lot about the elves, and on what would happen after the war. Specifically, what alerted me the most to his plans was that whenever he talked about land redistribution, he seemed to be thinking that the elves would get an equal share of all the ground lost to them in the war. Like we're going to let the group that literally killed everybody gain anything from this exercise in innocent burning and citizen murder not seen since China took one of those many lingering looks at all their natural resources around Japan in the early 1940s. He very clearly was out to help the elves, and I had to remind him many times that the elves were simply not considered an equal party in this discussion. To us, they were more like an infestation of rabid animals that had to be put down, and trust me, they were doing nothing to dissuade that opinion. So the fight begins, and our combined armies, fire-breathing wildlife, storm-summoning mates, and vengeful powers of God turn the opposing army into what could only be described as Verdun on steroids. In a big, super-powered climatic fight, we kill the Elf King, which was so anime-like, it literally ended with me pulling him into the air and punching him back to Earth. King gets condemned, and we celebrate our victory as our DM describes the opposing armies losing morale, struggling to regroup, and finally dissolving and running for the hills. And my paladin, knowing of the millions of innocent people those elves had murdered, knowing of his god's sense of justice, and not willing to allow them another chance to kill again, ordered his army to run them down and finish them off. Let not a man survive. Which in hindsight was a sterling example of gender discrimination, and probably led to some confusion down the line as what to do with all those female role models the elves presumably had. But hey, we won. And as I'm celebrating, the backstabber passes the DM a note. He reads it, nods, passes it back to him, and tells me the following. You are shot by the giant space gun owned by Backstabber. That man had watched the eye for an eye paladin give an order to destroy an army that had literally wiped out an entire continent's worth of innocent people, and had decided that the most balanced, level-headed response for his neutral good cleric was to attempt to kill that paladin, surrounded by an army 10 times his size, with a weapon that was very obviously commanded by him, while everyone was already highly suspicious and willing to murder them at the drop of a hat. But hey, as long as the paladin was dead, it wouldn't matter, right? Like when they killed Bin Laden, and now there's no terrorism anywhere in the world ever. Sterling planning skills there, Backstabber. Now you all probably know where this is going next, because you possess the superpower of having the knowledge of one regular human. Unless you're a scientist or something, in which case, shouldn't you be curing cancer or something right now? So his army is surrounded, captured, and interrogated. Those guilty of affiliation with Backstabber are tried, and those who aren't are disarmed and dishonorably discharged. Backstabber was shot down trying to flee, having put his masterful deductive skills to work once more and decided that fleeing on a bird from an army that was 60% missile troops was a foolproof strategy, and was tried, sentenced, and executed before the kettle finished boiling. The interesting thing that happened was with my character. The space gun was established to vaporize basically everything it touched, so one would have thought it was a no-brainer. But my character was really stupidly powerful, and it was pretty late game situation, so there were a lot of resistances and immunities to get through. Plus, D&D paladins were to balanced game designs when an IED is to a romantic stroll in the park, so there was a lot to consider. Straight away though, the DM established that the gun was not magical, to rule out my numerous magic resistant buffs and saving throw alterations. So while he and Backstabber were arguing about the merits of using a bird to escape a fire-breathing dragon, I idly flipped through my notes on the battle. Then I went back and examined them in more detail. Then I started to laugh. I laughed so much the other two stopped their argument to ask me what was so funny. First I asked for clarification and got it in writing that the space gun was not magical. Then tears of mirth poured from my eyes. I showed them the potion my character had necked during the Elf King fight, and that, according to the timeline, would still be in effect. a potion of invulnerability. For a number of rounds, I was completely untouchable by most forms of damage. You know, the only damage that could overcome those defenses? Magical damage. The only other player there, our illusionist, who refused to take sides, broke down cackling. Our DM was speechless, eventually ruling that my character took a minuscule amount of damage from being thrown back in the blast and was otherwise unhurt. Backstabber? Well, he was mad. He tried to retcon things, say that he waited for a few minutes before shooting me, that he left 10 minutes before the gun fired, saying that he didn't actually fire the gun at all, but instead got his visors to poison me, etc., etc. The DM and me shot down all attempts, and eventually he had to face the music. His character had been caught. The proverbial jig was unquestionably up. So ended our campaign, and ever since, he's never quite forgiven me for that incident. We're still good friends, and I still tease him about it from time to time, but in a good-natured way. It even became an in-joke among my other group after I shared the story with them, that whenever someone makes a stupid plan and overlooks something pretty obvious, we called it doing a chev, named after Backstabber's character. Here's the funny thing though, I'm glad he did it. My character's goal after this fight was to leave the fighting life behind and settle down on a farm somewhere far away where nobody could find him, and this gave him the perfect opportunity. After the blast, he simply slipped away, used the wish to turn himself invisible, and no one ever knew that he hadn't actually been vaporized. This led to some really fun role-playing with the illusionist, whose character basically regarded mine as a father figure, and spent the rest of their life looking for him. It also made things interesting for a follow-up campaign set just after the events of this one. Since my character was gone, it cleared a way for his second-in-command, a xenophobic, war-hungry general, to take over. And just to prove there's no hard feelings, I even played a former free elf soldier in that game. A satisfying ending, I would say. Betrayal stinks, but when you can take advantage of it like OP did, then it's not so bad. What do you all think about this story?